of a precipitous decline in the number of farms, dairy farms in the state, and the resulting, as Roger mentioned, idle infrastructure and land, and even some of that latent talent that is in our state that's not being employed in feed production or cattle production or milk production as a result of the decline. So some of the background came out of that. Chuck Ross, formerly I believe Secretary of Ag, he put out, when he was working for Extension, a call to action in 2018. That call to action's in the report. That was pretty motivating for me at that time to really take a look at what we could do to make up for the loss in agricultural GDP that is a result of the decline in the dairy industry and the contraction that was happening. And I was pretty motivated to take a look at beef as a real good opportunity for taking up the use of that land and idle infrastructure and talent. At the time, beef was a fledgling industry. There were less than 20,000 animals on the ground raised for beef. The markets were fractured, spurious, and a little unstable in the late 2000s. And there were a lot of emerging beef producers looking outside of Vermont for feeders. They were going to Alabama. They were going to the mid-Atlantic a little bit. They were pulling animals in to put them on feed in Vermont. And there was a lot of inconsistency in beef production as a result. And I started to talk to Joe Emenheiser, who has a background in genetics, and he taught me basically about crossbred vigor, how you can bring the best of both breeds on highly heritable traits, like growth and intermuscular fat, the things that consumers demand in beef. And sire selection becomes really, really critical in any kind of crossbred F1 program. And we got our first bit of funding in the beef industry from the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. I was working with Jake on an application for some funding just to do some ultrasound testing. So if beef producers need consistency and want to grow their operations, the thought was they got to understand what sires to use and why. And ultrasound testing for young bulls became, a target for just a little bit of research. We went down to Vermont Wagyu and started some ultrasound testing on young bulls to see how early we could detect their intermuscular fat potential. We started at 6 months up to yearling stage and did several studies several tests, ultrasound tests on several bulls to help Sheila Patinkin determine what sires to use in her herd, but in the process learned about the potential of ultrasound testing. Oddly enough, at about this time, 2019, we started to see big data emerge, especially in the beef on dairy opportunity. Holstein and Simmental formed a partnership called Wholesome at the time, and they were promoting the use of Simmental and Simmental cross bulls on dairy animals in order to produce pretty consistent beef on dairy animals. And they were claiming that every 4 to 6 weeks they were using carcass data from large pack houses in order to trace and predict which sires would be most optimal on beef on dairy. And this Wholesome program was promoted, and it was a pretty, at the time, interesting concept that you could actually get predictive quality on sire selection for beef on dairy. Now, consistency is really important in beef on dairy, and you get it with the Holstein dam. I believe most Holsteins can be traced back to just a couple bulls, and so you have a lot of consistency on the dairy herds on the dam side. And so sire selection becomes integral for a beef production plan. And about that time, I was also introduced to Dayona Farm. Mark, Bryson, and Elaine are down there using Wagyu bulls over heifers because they got the calving ease. And so on top of calving ease, they also held animals and put animals on feed for on their refusals, the dairy refusals, and basically turned a waste into a profit opportunity on their farm through diversification. They had beef sales with high-end premium beef, prime plus grade, and we started to think through, what could we do in Vermont to really understand this beef on dairy opportunity. Is there a way to utilize all these open gestations on dairy farms in Vermont to jumpstart our fledgling beef industry in Vermont? And so that's the background on this entire pilot study. How can we choose sires wisely, and how can we take advantage of economic engines on dairy farms? These open cows that don't need to be producing replacements. The conditions were right. If you rewind the clock a little bit and just remember for a second, in 2018, there were low milk pay prices. There were depressed feeder prices on cattle. It was tough to get $1.25 for feeder calves at 500 pounds. And then there were severe dairy discounts on calves. Bob calves and the like were, very hard to get any kind of money for. I tell this story, I've told it a few times, some of you have heard it before, but I was in a business planning meeting with a family. They were trying to figure out how to bring in the next generation, and the proprietor of the farm, he brought out a check to show me what he just got for his calves, and it was a negative $9.76 check from one of the dairy co-ops in our state. And it was humorous because he sent maybe one or two animals and the cost of shipping exceeded what he was getting paid, and they actually issued a negative check. And so this is 2018, 2019, and things have changed a lot, but these were the conditions at the time. So in 2021, we'll go to the next the next slide. In 2021, Vermont Community Foundation we applied, and they offered us some money to do a readiness survey. We found participants for the program that we were promoting, which was a pilot demonstration of 100 animals that we put on feed and track their costs, understand the economic potential of this at scale, use these 100 animals to raise them, track the costs, the gain rates, and then feed them out to finish and test markets, multiple market channels was the goal. They said, well, let's do a readiness survey. Are there people that want to do this? Are there producers interested? And we found Dayona Farm, Roman Way Farm, Don Sim Farm, and Springbrook Organic Farm, all interested in breeding for us. And then we found several feeders, folks at Green Dream Farm, the Wagners, the Parkers up in the Northeast Kingdom. And then we had also Robert Stickney at Bevinity Farm also was interested. So we had several participants wanting to be involved in this study. At the time, if you remember, again, go back a little bit in time, markets were paying $2.15 live weight for Wagyu finished animals, and they were paying about $1.70 live weight for Angus finished animals. And so there was a premium that could be gained, about a 30% premium if we were putting Wagyu over Holstein. And we thought that premium is something to target. So we put a lot of our animals in this study were Wagyu crossover Holstein, but we also wanted to have representation of Angus, and so we have Angus data to compare, and that's what you'll see in this presentation. So we've now finished, we started and finished over 100 animals in the pilot demonstration. We've marketed them now into various channels, and we've got some results we'd like to share and some recommendations to discuss. Before we begin, I want to start with some constructs that make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what are the constructs we use for tracking that data, important data points for analysis. First off, You'll see in the summary data, if you get into the report, there is a spreadsheet in there that has all the summary data. We've basically split up all of the data into 5 growth intervals for animals as they're marketed, as we see. We've tried to distill it down. There's more you could tease out by weight class, but we've chosen to go day to week old class calves being sold, wean calves at about 280 to 300 pounds. Feeder calves that are 6 months old, 5 and 6 weights, and then yearlings that would be 800 to 1,000 pounds, yearling animals ready for finish, and then there's finished fats. So there's 5 categories, intervals that we've split up the data into. We've got ADG, you'll see average daily gain. That's if you take the total days of that period of growth and divide their weight gain during that period, you get an average daily gain. And then we also have cost of gain. That's the cost of gain per pound during that same interval period. We calculated the costs and divided by the pounds that were gained during that time to get a cost of gain per pound. What quickly emerged for us in this project is that we also needed to understand what we're calling the earned value of the gain. In other words, if I want to hold this animal from feeder class out to yearling, what do I stand to gain economically? So we have in there an earned value of gain, which is basically the market pay price, less the costs to produce during that interval, less previous costs as well. And that gives you a sense of how much you can gain economically if you do hold animals into further classes. Lastly, as we spoke, there's marketing costs for every different step you take in the value chain. So we've tried to take into consideration transaction costs and also a net pay price. You'll see that in the definitions. And the net pay price is basically your cost to produce, your pay price less your cost to produce and to market, which includes processing, packaging, distribution for various stages in the value chain. So let's dig into the results. There's some summary data available, like I said, in the report, but I want to just highlight a few things that stood out to us. First is the breed difference. As you would expect and what we expected, the Angus were going to grow faster, and they did. They grew faster at every single stage of growth. They were born heavier, and then they were weaned at a higher weight. Feeder weights were better, and on through. What was interesting to us is that the differences in pay price drastically affected what decision you make on the sire selection. And we'll go to the next slide on that. We'll get to that in a second, but we also looked at what the costs of the gain were. Here, give me just a second here. Catch up. The cost of the gains varied also among breeds. So not only did they gain faster, Angus, but they actually cost quite a bit less. You'll see that in the summary data. But they also tracked on a similar trend. We saw, the costs to wean a calf, birth to weaning was your highest period. You got animals on milk replacer. There's a lot of manual labor involved, twice daily feedings, and we saw a really high cost for those pounds early, but then it dropped off to the very lowest cost per pound of gain during that post-weaning to feeder stage when the animals are small and gaining fast, and then it trended upward in the cost of gain to where yearling to finish we saw, it's climbing back up well into the above $2 a pound, or right at $2 a pound. So it's important to kind of track those costs, we thought, and report on those differences. Next is the feed difference. Just briefly, I'm going to mention, because of the limits and constraints of 100 animals, we only had a few organic animals in the program. Those costs were estimated at 25 to 30% higher for those animals, and because we didn't have a substantial number, we weren't able to find any markets that would reward the organic label. So in our estimation, we don't have a whole lot of results there, but we do recommend for anybody interested in organic production, if you can find markets that reward you better than 25 or 30%, you would be safe to stay in that production. But we didn't find them. We don't know if they exist. Perhaps they do, but that would be something you need to consider. Pay price over time. Let's get to that. This was rather unexpected over the course of our project, as you might guess. In 2022, like I said, the pay price, 22 and 23, the pay price for a calf was $200. We were paying $200 flat rate for day-to-week-old calves with 1 or 2 doses of colostrum. In 25, those same Wagyu calves were on average for the year costing over $1,069. That's a 435% increase. On the Angus, it was over 500% increase. And that's on the average. By the last quarter of 25 and even early in here in 26, we're seeing yet another 25% increase in those pay prices. So we saw that pay price over time stresses just how important it is to pay attention to the market, its activity, and how it affects your production planning and your marketing plans for any beef on dairy. This was a significant market shift that we've all experienced and witnessed over the past few years, a market shift due to supply deficits in the beef supply chain, and also accompanying that a beef demand surge at the counter. There's drought, screwworm, aging ranchers, all contributing to that supply deficit, and we saw a drastic shift over the course of this project. Very unexpected, but something to take into consideration and weigh out. Next slide, please. Lastly, we did learn that, breed difference over time makes a difference. As the old adage says, pounds pay. Somewhere around late 24 to early 25, we reached parity between Wagyu and Angus, and so the breed difference in profitability was basically pancaked. There was no additional margin able to be gained by producing premium quality beef and hold them longer on feed with the Wagyu, and it just simply paid to have Angus. You'll see some of the breed difference changes over time in this table, and you can see that consistently it made sense 23 on into 25 to be producing Angus crosses if you were going to be in the commodity market. Lastly, earned value of gain as far as the results. Any producer that's in the beef on dairy production chain has got to be considering, do I hold these animals to the next class or do I sell based on market prices? And we found that this table captured for us two ways of presenting the same data. One is, what can I gain? What's the earned value of gain per pound if I hold these animals? Wagyu, in this situation, the earned value of gain, there was actually significant loss birth to weaning. If you look at the red, that's kind of what everybody wants to target early on, is like, when am I going to lose? You're losing money now, birth to weaning. There's no gain, and you have to hold those animals probably out to 500, 600 pounds in order to recoup that gain and start gaining, profitability on these feeder calves. Same with the Angus. You're losing money now because of the cost of the calf. You're losing money if you sell that animal at 300 pounds. You've got to hold them out to 6 months, but once you do, there is money to be gained. We presented this by pound, if you like to figure that way, or by head, and you'll be able to see and calculate using this data if this is something you might be interested in doing, be involved in. But more importantly, if you're in it and you have animals, what kind of planning should I do? We'd like you to be able to use this data, and we actually developed a tool we'll get to at the end of this that'll show you how to plug in your own information. You can start with our base data on this tool, plug in your cost of concentrate, your cost of forage, cost of milk replacer, or if you're using waste milk, you might plug in something different there. But this is a tool you can use, plug in real market price data, and get a plan together for where you want to find your place in the production and supply chain. But earned value of gain, we found, is really a sell hold tool, and a piece of data that is important for decision making. Let's talk lastly the results of the market channels and transaction costs. A lot of us want to go for the long dollar. We want to go for that high price steak. We want to go for getting a lot of revenue out of each animal. We found that there's kind of a sweet spot with low transaction costs. We're calling it live wholesale white label, where you're selling live animals ready for slaughter. We call it onesies, twosies, a few animals from the barn that are fat and ready to go into somebody else's label. And there's a demand for these labels to have good quality beef. And we found that with no transaction costs other than your time at the barn to load the animal, that's kind of a sweet spot, and it's negotiable on pay price, and it gives you a total revenue per head that is significantly higher than commodity pricing. We found that the shipping costs or shrink, as it's said, the transaction cost in the first line, live wholesale fats, is substantial. And $61 a head, that cuts in your margin quite a bit, to where your gross revenue per head is hovering around $3,000 for 1,400 pound animals. And that was at $2.15 pay price. Now it's better now, and you can certainly get better than that. But the data we're using is off average 25 numbers. Lastly, when you get into processing beef, so once that animal, you commit to processing that animal, you can sell it wholesale or retail. We did both for the project, and we found that processing whole cut beef into subprimals and either grind or trim that's bagged, our transaction cost per head was mainly the distribution and the processing at $9.78 a head, which reduced, even though we were able to achieve about $5 a pound consistently hanging weight, we were still doing all that activity, absorbing that level of risk, and getting paid about the same as white label, which we found that's probably not worth it, getting an extra $30 or $40 a head. It might be, depending on your scale, but our estimation is that there's enough risk in there that it might be better just to stick with white label, unless you go for the long dollar. And that's where we set up a website. You could get beef on your porch the next day, frozen beef, and order online. We went about doing some fairly sophisticated marketing with the marketing firm, using CTV campaigns and other socials and such, basically selling online through to the metro regions. And we found that the overall costs were about a little over $5,000 a head. Now that includes the cost of getting new customers. We estimated about $100 per new customer. It also includes packaging, shipping. Now sometimes we were able to pass that on, but a lot of times we had to promote with free shipping in order to get sales to kick off. So we're getting pay price of $15.70 a pound. That's cut weight. That's 605 pounds is cut weight. But you're paying quite a bit to build that retail market and keep the attention of the consumers in these busy and noisy online marketing channels. And so you're able to bring in another $500 a head. They're at $39.19, so about $4,000 a head roughly. But it costs you, and we found also that it's about 30 transactions per head to sell through the carcass. So something to consider for market channel choices and transaction costs at play. Okay, before we move on, are there any questions or clarifications needed before we get into some of the recommendations and discussion? Any questions? Okay, there'll be another chance here at the end. We'll like to workshop that tool a little bit, and hopefully that'll stimulate some interaction if it's desired. Let's go on to the first part of our discussion. In the report you'll read, we have discussion around production. For producers here, we're really angling a lot of this presentation toward you. In there's health and vaccination protocols that Roger's developed that are easy to follow as far as implementation. And we found that kept us below a 3% mortality rate on our animals. So, it works. And I would recommend, the health and vaccination, not only for eliminating loss on your own farm, but also there's ways to upsell to buyers with these vaccination programs. You can find just a quick search on vaccination programs. They have tag programs. I know that there's several brokers that will help market your animals if they have vaccinations on board, and third-party verification for the use of teeing up animals for later stage supply and production. There's also ways to do parent verification if you have breed specific or other attributes you're trying to angle for. There's ways to do DNA testing. We've done that. It's about $20 a head, but it's worth it if the pay price is good. Can be worth it. And we would recommend, looking into some of those programs for parent verification, sire verification on top of any beef on dairy being produced. We also recommend ways to lower your costs by aggregating. The dairy gestations that are available for beef on dairy tend to be seasonal and then also kind of intermittent, but it does give you a year-round supply. However, you can't consolidate all your production the way cow-calf producers do into just a spring group and a fall group or the like. And so aggregating calves and producing calves seems to be something that's essential to lower costs due to shipping. A lot of the folks want 50,000-pound pot loads of whatever class animal you're sending to keep their costs down. Even in a seller's market, they're going to discount animals if they're not on a full load. There's also, we don't recommend, if you get into the report, there's recommendations for some insurance if you plan to hold animals. There's livestock risk protection that gives you a floor price. You can lock that in with any insurance agent at any given time at the end of the market close for commodity futures, and you can lock that in so that you guarantee that you would get margin. It's essentially margin protection for you if you are deciding to hold animals. So the way that works is pretty straightforward. You lock in a future price for the next stage that you're trying to grow to, and you pay a premium for up to 80% protection. You can go even higher, 90% protection if you want. The premium goes up, but that at least locks in a floor price for you. And then lastly, we would make a strong recommendation and see the importance, I think you will as well, for handling facilities to be able to handle animals safely, get them weighed consistently. That's tub, alley, and chute, and scales. If you don't have those on your farm, it becomes very difficult to track data and get your own data. You can use ours for a while, but you really won't know. You'll be flying blind. So we'd recommend handling facilities on your farm for whatever class of animals you decide to produce. Next slide, please. Next, we saw the importance of market awareness. The 5-area average is really critical to keep track of. If you don't have a news source for that or a feed for that information, you'll want to get that. You can go out to USDA, the EMS, is it? Yeah, the marketing service, EMS, I believe, has all that data for local sale barns and also the 5-area averages, which there's 5 areas in the country that collate their data, and that's an important market piece to keep aware of. There's traceability required. Your EIDs or 701X programs will give you traceability on the animal. That's important for downstream when you're selling into the larger markets. And then, like I mentioned, the tag programs for vaccination protocols are really important for marketing live animals into the commodity market. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Next, we saw the importance of really recognizing value in your production planning. There's animals that are sold, can be sold live on the hoof or on grade. And when they're sold on grade, there's premiums for quality and yield grade, but there's also deducts for both of those as well. In the report, we have a sample payout report that has some of the detail on that, how those deducts work and how the yield grade is either rewarded or deducted. We found that beef on dairy did suffer yield grade deducts consistently, even though we were achieving premiums on grade, choice or above, into prime. We were suffering yield deducts that would eat into that benefit. I have some data on the next slide that'll show how we did on our project animals. Our average yield was 62.35% for our animals. That's, if you have a 1,000-pound live animal, that's 623 pounds of hanging weight. Our average grading for our Wagyu animals, choice or above, was 96.5%, or choice or above, which is really solid. That gives you the base choice price or premiums on and above, sometimes 15 to 20 cents per pound for hanging weight for achieving higher grade than choice. But our average deducts for yield grade were $203 per load of 50,000. So it's not big, but it does eat into your profit. And then the average premiums for quality grade were on average $702.67, $703 per load. So netted roughly 500 extra when we were using the Wagyu animals for achieving premiums. Also in your report, you'll see if you are going to go for the long dollar and merchandise beef cuts, we had a butcher lay out how they optimized the carcass by how they cut it and sold it through their retail shelves. And there's a couple different cutouts in there that give you an idea of how much you can optimize a carcass by cut and push the price per pound and total carcass revenue up using those tactics. So that's some of our discussion there, and I'm going to move on now to some of our recommendations. For producers, our biggest recommendation is that we find a way to hold calves. We think that's essential. There's got to be incentives ideally we get some incentives from the state to build out infrastructure for aggregating calves, putting them on feed, using auto feeders and such. There's ways to produce calves at scale that are being done in other parts of the country that we really don't see done at scale in Vermont. And we would like to encourage whatever incentives are available for producers to build out that infrastructure and begin to aggregate day to week old calves. Essentially, if these calves continue to leave the state, so does all the economic activity around that calf for the rest of its life. And our estimation and what we understand to be happening is close to 80% of the calves are leaving the state at day to week old. So there's a lot of economic loss leaving and being gained somewhere else. And so we're going to encourage some risk, calculated risk being taken for producers, new producers. We feel like this is a real good opportunity for both, private and public partnerships to get calf facilities available that would enable aggregation at all classes. So that's our number one recommendation is incentives to hold and aggregate calves in the state of Vermont. Our next recommendation is for subsidy for financing these improvements. Several improvements that go along with our discussion and recommendations. One is we think financing is essential for handling facilities and scales on farms who are producing beef on dairy cattle at scale. A whole setup, kit and caboodle. We purchased a portable AeroQuip for this project, and I think at the time it was about $40,000. That's at a minimum just to get set up to be able to move your animals through and get weights consistently. So it will pay for itself with good data, but you're going to need to invest, and ideally there's some financing incentives and subsidy for financing on scales. There's also the need for subsidy on infrastructure to house and feed bottle calves. In the report, you'll see a model calf barn that has a plug-and-play unit that can go into any barn in the center and have 4 quadrants where animals, or 20 to 25, will each have their individualized feeder. It has people access to the center where you can put in milker placer, and these auto feeders self-clean. I think we estimated around 50 to 60,000 for the unit installed, and that includes running power and water for it as well. So, those plug and play units are available if you have an existing structure. If you don't have the structure, all in, we're estimating about 450 to 500,000 for the entire structure that could produce between 800 and 1,000 starter calves every year out of one of those units. So, yeah. We also would recommend subsidy for marketing, shared marketing, storage, and distribution for co-branded products. We saw that as a big holdup, especially when we looked at opportunities to get that long dollar and get that extra $500 ahead. The amount of volume of transactions and the cost of obtaining new customers and keeping their attention was high. And unless that's shared among multiple producers, it's going to be challenging for individual operations to manage that and blend that in. Our next recommendation is for funding research. One of the things that's unique that's come out of this project is we've partnered with Vermont Cattlemen has partnered with USDA, and we have a long-term sire study. One of the big levers you can pull in beef on dairy production is feed efficiency. So if the 2 animals eat 5 pounds of feed and one gains 1 pound and the other one gains 2 pounds, we want to know if that's sire specific. That's essentially what the study's about. And we've partnered with, they have a research station in Burlington. And I believe Chris Peters is here with us today. I want to just give a shout out to Chris and Matt McIntosh, who are working with us on that, and give them a chance to maybe introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about the USDA Service Center up there and the research that's going on. Chris, are you with us?
I am, Kevin. Thank you for the introduction. And
Sure.
I'll be brief because I want to leave time for discussion to everyone else on the call. But to make long short, the USDA's Agricultural Research Service started a new location in Burlington, Vermont, in partnership with the University of Vermont. Funding first came in 2019, and I started on the job in 2021. Takes a little time to get people hired. So we've been here about 5 years, and our mission really is to study agriculture from farm to fork, and beef on dairy is a part of that. We recognize that this is a real opportunity, and I happen to hear a talk from Kevin early on in that project that you mentioned before the pilot study. So we're really excited about this new collaboration with Vermont Cattlemen. And I'll pass the mic to Matt for a moment so he can say a few words about the study. Thanks again, Kevin.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Matt, are you with us?
I think you're muted,
Oh,
Matt.
oh, I'm blabbing, but I'm muted. Nice to be with everybody. I have a double mute option. So we have a couple studies planned with Kevin and Roger at Vermont Cattlemen. They set up basically a research barn at their facility. So we have several pens with back-to-back studies planned. We've got automated feeders, so we'll be measuring individual animal intake over time. The first study is a bit of a power study to make sure that our statistics are in order. The next study, we're going to be doing a Wagyu Holstein sire study so that we can basically flesh out differences in production and carcass traits and finances associated with different sires, Wagyu sires. And then the third study planned will look at different sires of Angus and Wagyu origin, and then do a sort of more nuanced analysis comparing those crossbreeds, and then the within sire effects as well. Happy to say more, but awesome presentation, Kevin. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. I'll also just put a plug in for one of our on-farm presentations that's coming up. We will be at that Chester facility where the research is happening. You'll be able to see kind of the setup, and we'll talk more about it there as well if you'd like to come out. So thank you, Chris and Matt. We're excited about the research. We have a strong recommendation for more of it, and also have recommendations for technical assistance. Obviously, getting into this space requires a little more TA, technical assistance, some trainings. We'd like to see some funding for consultancy and trainings on this to set up business planning for your place in the value chain for production. Lastly, we'd like to see some help on some of these tools, more refinement of tools. We've developed one, but it needs kind of live feed of data because it's just hard to keep up with all the changes in the market. So, we'd like to see some funding for some of these phone apps that could be used by farmers to get real-time data with their own production plans. Got a few concluding statements. Selena, I see your question, and I think there's plenty of stuff in the chats. Let me hold on that just 1 minute. Let me just have some closing statements. When we calculated the economic impact potential, this is just kind of, it's rather gross in the and a little rough, but the investments that we're talking about for incentive and subsidy could have a serious impact on Vermont ag GDP. We estimate that if there are 4 hubs, and you'll see this in the report, if there were 4 hubs for calf raising facilities, that might cost about $10 million, okay? Of that $10 million, we'd have a hub in Franklin County, for instance, maybe up in St. Jay, another one in Randolph, another one in somewhere in the Champlain Valley. We'd be potentially producing up to 40,000 calves annually through those units. And that's just capturing the lower 30% of the milking herd that are likely to not be used for replacements on dairy farms in Vermont. If those animals were marketed 50% live feeders and 50% finished, aggregated as such, that would bring an estimated additional $120 million in Vermont revenues to producers annually, and additional, somewhere between 90 and $100 million to vendors and suppliers to produce those animals. We're talking feed, shipping, everything that goes into that, bedding, and whatnot. So we would recommend strongly some subsidy or some incentives for folks who would set up some prototypes in Addison County and Franklin County. Those are optimal locations for aggregating and where the dairies are fairly consolidated. Logistics are fairly reasonable. And so you'll read a little bit about that in our report. That's our strongest recommendation because of the potential impact on the ag GDP and the benefit that would come to producers, utilization of land. I think Rogers said it several times that anywhere from 2 to 5 acres per head would be required for both grazing and forage production during the life of that animal. And so you can imagine, if you extrapolate this out, 40,000 animals, those are some serious acres that could be put into production before we return to forest. So those are our recommendations. And I'd like to move on. A couple options. We could go to the tool and do a demo, which I would like to do at some point if it's amenable. But I also want to start with some Q&A. I know there's some hands up, some questions in the comments. Maybe, Jake, if you're comfortable, could you facilitate some of those questions for us?
Yeah. So I think, Kevin, that question from Selena of any projections on beef prices for the rest of the year.
Well, I think we've seen some, dip in, with futures, with the screwworm showing up in Texas. I think that's the latest, but, the fundamentals are there. The fundamentals of low supply, high demand. We really have not seen demand tail off much at the shelf, and we know that supply is still declining. Now, there were a lot of feeder placements went up 6% last month. A lot of that had to do, we think, with sell-offs for the fire and drought, but also I think what we're seeing there is a little bit of the beef on dairy impact. That placements are coming up because there's more beef on dairy in the supply chain. So we think it's happening other places, and we may not be participating in it as much directly or as long as we could be. But I don't anticipate the fundamentals changing in any reasonable forecast in the next 3 to 4 years. So prices would stay flat or continue to rise in that scenario.
Yeah.
But that's just me. Yeah.
Yeah. That's helpful. If folks are on a phone and maybe having trouble accessing either the chat or the raising the hand, you can just kind of jump in, unmute yourself if you got a question. And then, if folks are open to it as well, if we could just go maybe 5 minutes over to see the tool and demo that, Kevin, and I think that'd be good. So any more questions, clarifying questions about the project, the recommendations?
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to share my screen. I'm overriding you now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, good. That's good.
Okay. So what we've developed for a tool, it's got 3 different parts. This first part is what we were using in large part to predict what kind of target weights we wanted. You'll see in the target weight in column G, what kind of target weight's necessary to be able to cover our costs. In a break-even scenario, we needed animals to hit 92% of that target weight in the Angus template, which is what we've shared. in this tool, anything that's highlighted yellow, you can use this. We put it out there for you to use. You can plug in your cost of concentrate per ton. We averaged about 360. Our cost for forage was 160 a ton, and then our cost of milk replacer was on average about $85. It distills, if you stay out of the gray, those are all formulas to kind of take your raw data and reformulate it based on what we saw consumption rates being by body weight. It's all kind of distilled down. You can put in your calf cost. Maybe you want to pay yourself for your calf if you're a dairyman, or maybe you're out trying to aggregate and buy calves. You can plug in whatever the number is for the calf costs. You can plug in your average cost per day for yardage. If you're using existing infrastructure, obviously you need to figure that. It might be, you might want to see what it's like when it's not cash. If it's zero, see what it is. We were paying our producers, our custom producers, these rates, and they seemed amenable to cover their costs, so we're including them here. We have our data for average daily gain. Obviously, you can plug in your own numbers there for average daily gain. And then the market prices. If you go look at column I, you can plug in current market prices. We're using averages from 2025 in this scenario just to see how it played out at the end of our study. And what you see as it flows over, you'll see if I sell my wean calf, for instance, in column 8, if I sell that animal, my sale price would be about $16.80 if I'm getting $7 a pound. And you can plug in your actual weight. In this case, we put it in 240. And then you're going to know what your gross profit is and what your profit percentage is. Now, you'll notice the highest percentage of profit is probably to be gained around 26 weeks. That's about 6 months old. But we also think that there's potential profit and worth holding animals on into that post feeder into the yearling stage. We're talking 6 weights, 7 weights. We think that's optimal perhaps. And then it starts to decline. By the time they get to yearling stage, the profit percentage declines, and we're down around 20% profit margin, gross margin. And then by the time they finish at today's prices at 250 live weight, we're only making 8%. So you can see kind of the economic cost. If you have a lot of space and you're trying to fill it up, you know, an extra $200 a head is probably worth getting and holding them out to finish. But if you don't have space and you're saying, how do I get the most out of my calves before I let them go and max out my space and my labor, maybe you sell them off at 500, 600, 700 pounds. This is a tool to kind of use data, figure out your break-even weights so you can cull animals that we always called poor doers. Roger had that term, and I think it's well accepted. Our poor doers would leave if they weren't hitting target weights. And then, but it gives you, am I in the red on this animal? Do I need to sell it? Or am I still in the green and I can still gain some profit? Now, if this is something you want to really tease out and make some plans, and you need a per diem cash flow budget, you can plug in the numbers of animals you have by class, use our data, and figure out what your costs are per day. Your per diem cost in this scenario where you have 120 animals on the ground. We ran out a scenario where you're starting 5 animals every month. It's kind of like a hypothetical, 300 cow dairy that wants to start and hold 5 calves a month. Roughly. That's 60 a year that could be used for beef on dairy, and they want to get into this game. They want to buy, they want to sell, those kind of things. It's going to cost you at full tilt about $466 a day. You need a monthly budget of about $14,000 and an annual budget of about $167,000 for your annual cost. We ran out a 3-year scenario where maybe you don't have a facility, you want to start from scratch, or you want to just build something out new. You're going to spend $300,000 on that barn and setup, and it's going to cost you about 10% to do that. So your total cost, if you go down here to row 60 and 61, about $330,000. And at the end of 3 years in this scenario, if you're selling feeders, selling off feeders to cover your cash flow, we saw July, October, November, you're going to need to sell animals to keep your cash afloat and pay as you go. At the end of your first year, you're only losing $294. You're losing about $7,000 in the next year. And then the final year, you're gaining back a total of $1,928. And so it's basically a break-even scenario where you, at the end of 3 years, you would have $324,000 worth of animals on the ground that you're managing and selling into various markets, and you've got your capital improvements basically paid for, and it only costs you $3,000 cash in that scenario. So you can plug in what your plans are, but this was kind of a first run at, okay, if somebody wants to get into this and be in the beef business, truly diversify, make their plans and get a budget going, this is at least a start for you. So I'd like to answer any questions, run any scenarios anybody like to see. I thought it was just for kicks. What if your cost of concentrate was less? Maybe you just go with canola meal and some mineral and bulk up on your forage, and maybe you run your costs down to 220 on your scenario. You can see how it starts to affect the profitability. Maybe you're paying $1,700 a calf in that scenario, because you really want to just make sure you're getting paid if you're leaving money on the table. What's that do? Well, now you can, if you're paying $1,700 a calf, and those are your scenarios, you're only maybe making 6%. That'd be $140 a head at feeder stage. So, and then you might be facing some losses thereafter. So dialing in what your true costs are seems really important. We're also available after this call. Maybe Jake, you could share our contact information on the chat. We'd be happy to work with anybody, or you can come to one of our on-farm outreaches coming up.
Yeah, and we will send out links to this recording so folks can review things again. Yeah, we'll have the contact info for Kevin and Roger. I think there's definitely a lot to digest here and consider. So hopefully folks will have some follow-up questions and inquiries for you, Kevin and Roger.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your time, you all, and your interest. Feel free to reach out or come to our on-farm events coming up July 25th and 26th. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks everybody
everyone
for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Roger.
You bet.
All right.